Alright, what's up guys? I hope you're doing well. James here from jamesdforsythe.com, back for another book review. This one is on The House of Morgan, An American Banking Dynasty and the Rise of Modern Finance by Ron Chernow. There's a picture of the cover, or just seeing the cover itself. And as you can see, it's pretty thick. It's like 720 pages or so. Basically, as you can expect, it's about the House of Morgan. Basically, it goes through about four generations of the House of Morgan itself and a lot of the history behind it. And I was quite surprised, to be honest, just by how in-depth it was. And like, it won the National Book Award, this one specifically, and it seems like Ron Chernow has won a few other awards for his writing as well, including the Pulitzer Prize for for his book Alexander Hamilton. Right, so he's done quite a few on, I guess, more like biography type books, like Alexander Hamilton. I believe he's done Ulysses S. Grant, George Washington, and he also has another one, I think, on one of the Morgans. I forget which one. In terms of JP or JS, I forget which one. And then, anyways, but that's just a little bit about the author, right? And so basically this book itself was published in 1990, and basically goes about the whole House of Morgan and its history from 1838 to 1989, right? And excuse the glancing down, I make notes just to keep me kind of going straight in terms of having a straight line of logic per se. But yeah, basically it goes about the whole House of Morgan, including its even all the way back back to the days of J.S. Morgan and George Peabody and the kind of creation of it itself, is specifically with like the relationships between New York, the House of Morgan in New York and also in London, and then also a little bit of when they had their, I don't know if you'd really say branch, but part of the house in Paris, right? And it really goes very in depth basically throughout the whole history. Like I said, it's 720 something pages, and that's not even including the bibliography, which is 11 pages, which is pretty extensive for a book, I think, at least from what I've noticed. It had indices, that sort of thing. It's just the content part of it, right? And so one of the reasons why I think it's important to read this one, not only just because of the history and kind of the historical context it gives, is also it's been called the most ambitious, quoting a Amazon review, the most ambitious history ever written about American finance. And so it really shows how not just the Morgans, but also kind of follows the story of the development of American finance in general, right? So even excluding the Morgans, it gives a good kind of conceptual argument for that as well, right? And so a lot of the times it's like he's explaining the history of American finance through the perspective of the Morgans, I guess would be the best way to describe it, right? Because it really is like almost all encompassing in that respect, from panics to changes in how basically banking happened in general, going from, say, I think the first one he calls, and I'll kind of use the table of contents. He has it in three parts. So he has the baronial age with barons, basically like the whole, which is 1838 to 1913. So basically pre-Federal Reserve, all pre-Federal Reserve, and goes all of the railroad tycoons, all of that. Like, and it really goes in depth in that respect. And then the next would be the diplomatic age, so basically the two world wars going from 1913 to 1948. And so you have both World War I and World War II, and basically how banking had changed in that respect to where it wasn't so much of like the bankers. It's not like with the panic of 1907 where you have the House of Morgan saving the entire United States in that respect, which is how it's portrayed in the book. I'm not going to say such a thing with such conviction, as I know there's a little bit of argument of how the technicalities behind that, and I'm just not going to go that far just yet, right? I think it needs more study. But regardless, where you have those sort of events happening, and then you come to the diplomatic age to where they take more of a back seat. In a way, they're not so much like you have the bankers, and that's basically what runs the entire world, right? And then, or at least on a very in-your-face kind of way. And you could argue that it becomes more superficial and they kind of lose power in practice through that respect. And then into the diplomatic age to where it's more of like, okay, now they're dealing with actual, like, they deal more with like politicians and the leaders of countries than they really do with they're more of like advisors at that point. And obviously I'm being very superficial in how I'm explaining it because it's 720 pages. And I mean, if I were to just read this to you, I found the audiobook for it as well, and it's like 37 hours if it's just reading like normal. So obviously it's a lot of content. But then to kind of continue, the next part he calls the Casino Age, which is basically from 1948 to 1989. So right before he published the book. And this is where you have a really American finance is kind of more of what we know it today, to where it's really the bankers aren't so much the ones dictating, especially the industrial kind of part of the country, right? You have more of where the industries and corporations have more power than the bankers themselves, right? To whereas beforehand it was kind of the other way around. If a corporation didn't have a specific banker and that relationship went awry, then basically the corporation got screwed. Whereas in this point, in the latter half of the 1900s, it basically was swapped to where if the corporations didn't want their banker, it was pretty much they could do what they wanted, and leave the banker if they wished. Whereas before that was considered suicide, from the perspective of the corporations. But to keep that in mind, another thing to kind of keep to continue, basically he does a very good job, I think, of bringing in other characters throughout history and showing how much power and basically how connected the House of Morgan was. And just to give some names of people who were very directly related to them throughout history and kind of relationships that are discussed in depth throughout the book. We have Charles Lindbergh, Henry Ford, FDR, Nancy Astor, and then Winston Churchill. It kind of goes, those are just a few examples. There's multiple other ones throughout the book, but those are kind of the big players, right? And so, yeah, one thing to keep in mind, and one thing about how the book is written that I kind of enjoyed was a lot of, so the titles of each chapter, and of which there are 36, they're all one word. I don't see a single one that has two words, but they're basically all about kind of a central person in a way. And then it kind of, you can notice in the story how it kind of branches off from that person throughout. But it seems like every time he branches off, it's more to give context to the general idea. And so you have ones like the first chapter, Scrooge, when he's really getting into the kind of the founding in general with J.S. Morgan and George Peabody, going more in depth with that. A few chapters later, you have the Corsair, where you really get basically the ships that the Morgans loved so much, it seemed. And basically it seemed like, I know Jack Morgan was really into ships, and they ended up building like obnoxious yachts in that sort of respect, for lack of a better term. I know one of them was actually commissioned and given to I think the British military or the British Navy at one point during, I think it was World War One. Obviously, it's 720 pages, so there's a lot of nuances and that sort of thing. And it's honestly one of those that I'm gonna have to read multiple times to really kind of understand and give specifics, right? So a lot of the times with the first reading, the best idea, especially with a book of this caliber and of this length, you have to deal with, the first reading is kind of just conceptually and kind of understanding the general progression of the history of itself, right? And so that's kind of what I'm remembering as I'm going through each chapter. It's one of those, it's a little bit fuzzy, but not, especially by the time you end up finishing the book, you kind of are already kind of forgetting the first part of the book because it's so long. Because it's also like, people have other things to do besides read all day sometimes, which can be unfortunate depending on whatever. One thing I didn't know about the House of Morgan was their involvement in the Titanic, right? And so I believe, because I know, let's see, I think it was J.P. Morgan Jr. or Sr. Basically, I don't want to say owned the Titanic, but basically they were competing with other kind of another corporation that was basically doing the same thing, and the Titanic was their version of it. There was a lot of competition in that respect, and I believe when they started dealing in the shipping industry, they kind of screwed up in that respect. But anyways, I'm not going to go too far in depth with that one. But yeah, basically just every single chapter is kind of about a person and that sort of thing, or one kind of generalized theme, as you could typically have. Like there's one called Mavericks, when you really get into the more modern finance in that respect, where you have basically the LBOs and that sort of thing with the leveraged buyouts, and basically how the Morgans were getting significantly more involved in corporate takeovers and that sort of thing. You have one called Samurai, and you kind of start to understand a lot of the interaction the House of Morgan had with Japan, especially throughout the mostly the 1900s, from my understanding. And then basically you have sheiks. You start to understand a lot of the House of Morgan's interactions with the Middle East in that respect. Like it's keeps going, right? And it goes into one of the biggest things that I remember from this book, and kind of a little bit of a sidetrack, was Thomas Lamont, and he came after Jack Morgan in terms of kind of leading the House of Morgan, right? And his involvement with Mussolini, right? And kind of how, I don't know if I'd say they were really like deep friends or whatever, but basically like his involvement in that. And he kind of gives a lot of context to where it's like, definitely from an outsider's point of view, it would seem that, he was a huge proponent of Italy basically doing everything they did in World War II. But I don't know, that's one of the big conceptual things that I'm not going to go articulate all the way through this, because it's a book review, not necessarily me telling the whole story. That's what you got to get the book for and read for yourself. But I'll definitely be going through this again, and when I do so, I'll probably go much more in depth in kind of more of the things that are more content within the book, per se, to where it's more fresh in my mind and that sort of thing. But anyways, he's also got, like, I noticed with a lot of these types of books, there's a bunch of pictures. If I can flip right to them, there they are. And so he's got that little kind of, I don't know if I'd say laminated pages, but like he's got 15 pages or so of just pictures. Like you can see this one, I don't know how bad the reflection is going to be, where you have Jack Morgan along with the circus midget Elia Graff in 1933. And basically, Pecora hearings. It goes into a lot of the hearings that you had and kind of the legal battles with the House of Morgan, to where they're really, I don't want to say being audited, but like the Pujo hearings in the early 1900s, like very early 1900s, and then you had the Pecora hearings for something different in the 1930s, and then there was another one that's leaving my mind as of right now. That was later, but regardless, anyways, here is another view of the cover. And this is just the one that I got. again. But anyways, I'm going to leave this one here. It's a fantastic read. Definitely going to be reading it again. So with that being said, I hope you guys have a good night, and I will see you on the next one.